Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer Parker, and right away I'm going to apologize for the raspiness in my voice. I'm fighting a bit of a cold this week, but I'm very excited to be interviewing Dr. David Hersh, and he is a sex therapist, certified, has been involved in all the sex therapy type of organizations, ASACT and ISHWISH, and many others, and so I'm very excited to have him here today to talk to us about how couples can get about having good sex. But before I get too far along, can you go ahead and give us a bit of an introduction of yourself, Dr. Hersh?
Sure.
And would you prefer for
Sure.
me to call you Dr. Hersh or David?
No, I'm David.
David. Okay.
Well, I'm a mere clinician. I've been doing what I do for about 40-odd years, and I received my training in sex therapy with Dr. Wardell Pomeroy, who was Kinsey's closest associate, and I mentored with him for about 5 years. And I'm probably one of the older guys in the field. I'm 76, and I still see some clients on a couple days a week. And I maintain an office in Calgary where I have a couple of colleagues. And I maintain an office at home in Nelson, British Columbia. And I see a lot of people on Skype.
Wonderful. Why don't we just ask the basic question as to what made you get interested in this field to begin with? How did you get involved in, first of all, becoming a clinician and then specifically specialized in sexuality?
So that's interesting to me. I did a master's degree and then started working on a doctorate, and I finally had enough of it, and I'd gone to school, and it was time to get out and work in the field, and I took a job as a therapist for the state of California back in 1966, and I became licensed as an LMFT, licensed marriage and family therapist, back in 1969, and for 10 years, I guess I plodded along at some level, avoiding dealing with sexuality because I had no specific training. And not in 69, the beginning, I got a note from the Board of Behavioral Science Examiners in California that said I needed an updated course in human sexuality to renew my license. Updated course? I'd never had any course in human sexuality. And so I was talking to a friend of mine who was a nurse, and I told her this. She said, I just did a SAR in San Francisco. It was a 7-8 day program. She said, you'll love it. So I said, I don't know if I really want to go to San Francisco for a day. I was living in Sacramento. She said, you'll love it. I said, okay, I'll go. So I did SAR.
And can you explain what SAR stands for?
Back when I did it, it was called Sexual Attitude Restructuring. And over the years, the term has become bastardized to Sexual Attitude Reassessment. I kind of like the harder term, restructuring, because it was a long program and very different from a lot of the programs that are called SAR nowadays, which may be 10 hours, which I think are totally ineffective. You don't have a long enough time to be able to get out of your head and to get onto the level of being able to process this stuff. So be it. And toward the end of SAR, one of the speakers was Wardell Pomeroy, and it just grabbed me. And so I closed my practice in Sacramento, moved lock, stock, and barrel down to San Francisco, started practice there, went to school, finished my doctorate at the Institute, dragged it on as long as I could so that I could do things with Wardell. I used to have lunch with him a number of times a week, and I'd drive him to the airport, I'd pick him up at the airport, I'd visit his apartment, played poker with him. I mean, so it was a wonderful experience. And all of a sudden, I started calling myself a sex therapist after a while. And I practiced in San Francisco until 1990 when I moved up to Nelson, British Columbia, which is a marvelous little town that in many ways is a miniature San Francisco. We've got over 350 turn of the century homes and old Victorians, and I own one myself. And so I've been here in Nelson, and in about 9, 10 years ago, I got office space in Calgary and been working there on and off for the last 9, 10 years. That's how I got into the field.
And what was it about this particular gentleman that really piqued your interest? What was he offering? What was he educating you on? And what were you learning at this sexual assessment restructuring?
Well, I'd always read about sexuality. I was one of those kids whose parents had books open on their shelves, and I read Havelock Ellis' Psychology of Sex back when I was about 10, 11 years old, and was fascinated by all of those strange Latin terms at the end of the book in the glossary. As a matter of fact, I used to pronounce fellatio Fellatio, because I didn't know the pronunciation of Latin. And it was always fascinating to me about these names for things that people did sexually, and that was my introduction to it. And I got a lot of information, but I got bits and pieces. I wasn't forming gestalts. I wasn't able to order the information that I have and organize it. And the years with Wardell helped me pick up additional data and help me structure it and organize it and be able to deal with it that way.
So you were trained in marriage and family therapy, and then It's interesting, right, to hear you talk about how there was really no sexual courses that were part of that training. And
no.
I was trained also in marriage and family therapy, and we did have one course, I think, in my master's program that was focused on sexuality, and yet after becoming certified as a sex therapist, obviously that's a very different process. And so those of us working in marriages and in couples work have very little know-how in how to address sexuality. And this is kind of one of the complaints that we see in the research as well, is that people really aren't talking much about sex in their therapy experiences with the people who are there to help them have better marriages. So that's just a really interesting conundrum.
I'm in British Columbia, and my registry up here, the British Columbia Association of Clinical Counselors, doesn't even require any sexuality training. I think it's audacious for anybody to do marriage and family therapy without having some training in human sexuality. I know I was certainly felt handcuffed in being able to explore those areas because I didn't have any confidence in any knowledge. And one of the things that I do up here is I try to consult with the people who are members of the association and try to prod them into at least asking the question, because if the therapist doesn't inquire about sexuality within a short period of time, the client will not say anything because they think that the therapist is uncomfortable with it. And so the therapist winds up doing what I call donut therapy. They miss that big hole in the center. They don't touch it. And they really can't understand what all of the issues are that come from an initial presentation of something about the relationship. Because in fact, if you talk about the relationship, you really can't even guess about what's going on in the sexual part of their lives. But if you ask about the sexual part of their lives and get information about that, you can very much extrapolate about how the communications go in many other non-sexual areas of the couple.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Why don't you expound on that a little? Because what that reminds me of is there can be people that can have really good friendships, really good abilities to talk about all kinds of different aspects in their relational life, but don't necessarily have what they would deem a satisfying or good sex life. And there's other people that kind of go at it, have a lot of conflict, are not necessarily in a place where they're having great, what we'd call relational quality, and yet can get quite passionate and hot in the bedroom. And so it's just interesting, all the different spectrumed approaches that couples can take. So why don't you go ahead and expound on some of examples of how you would
Probably a good way is to tell you a story that I was going to tell you before we started. And so maybe this would be a good time. When I first moved up here in British Columbia, I met a woman who said to me, I have a women's group. We're a half a dozen women and we meet once a month, and we very often we'll have somebody talk to us. We'll have a topic, and we'll have dinner together, a potluck. Would you come and share an evening with us? And I said, sure. She said, would you come to us and talk about how to increase passion in a relationship? I said, sure. And so I sat down at my desk one day, and I didn't know where to start. And all that came up in my mind is all the things that kill passion in a relationship. And I wrote down a list of 3 dozen passion killers. And only the last one deals with sexual dysfunction, a broad term that we could talk about orgasmic concerns, painful intercourse, rapid ejaculation, erectile issues, whatever. But there are so many things that interfere with them. And I'm certainly not going to read you a list of 35 of them. It's just the first one that came to my head. I wrote down, and I just wrote these down in no specific order, is that one partner does all the sexual initiation. In other words, one partner is taking all the risk for rejection. And that all of the initiation is done non-verbally. I kind of joking say, how do you initiate it to people? And they hesitate or something, and I'll say, how about, hey, are you awake? And they laugh. And that's, in fact, how a lot of people initiate. They get into bed, they're ready to go to sleep. All of a sudden, she rolls over to go to sleep, and she feels a hardness at her back. And her mind is on tomorrow already, and oh, gee, I really don't want to have sex, but I have to. This is a good way of killing passion. People get into routines, and they get boredom, and there's familiarity, and they don't have an ability to explore. And again, these are all things that have nothing to do with sexual dysfunction. And in fact, within the relationships, it's not usually about the disability or the primary reason that they may have contacted me. It's about all of these other things about the communication on getting to where they're able to enjoy sex with each other spontaneously, planned, and as adults for pleasure. That in fact, if you're not trying to procreate, sex is like chocolate. Some people like it more than others. Some people like more of it or less of it, or more frequency or less frequency, or with more different types of meals. But it's just different. It's not a have to. But unfortunately, it's one of those things that's not found out until people all of a sudden say, I do, and then they find out, oh, he or she doesn't.
Well, I wouldn't mind going down your list of 35 things that you thought of that are passion killers.
You just want me to read you off down from the top?
I'd love that.
Sure, okay. So I basically told you the first three. Number 4 is that you can only be sexual in the dark and quiet. Number 5, that there's a distraction or an interruption during sex. The television, the telephone, the kids, the notification from your cell phone that somebody is texting you. Number 6, you have acquiescence rather than responsiveness. You don't have the ability to say no, and you wind up being sexual when you'd rather not. And probably one of the most common ones that I see in practice, and I would guess that you do, is that there's a wide disparity between partners in the desired frequency within an exclusive sexual relationship. I call that my catch-22. Mm-hmm. When there's a large disparity, the one who wants more always loses. Because the one who wants less is either getting as much as they want or as much as they can tolerate. Also, number 8, not being able to share sexual fantasy material. 9, there's no sexual conversation outside of bed. 10, there's anger about the non-sexual aspects of their relationship. Some people like to have make-up sex, so they wind up having a fight just so that they can make up in bed. Number 11 is, I say, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. That it's very goal-directed, it's very quick, there's no human connection. As a matter of fact, I talk about the marital bed or the partnership bed as an adult sandbox. As a kid, you go to the park with mommy. Today you bring your truck. Tomorrow you bring your pail and shovel, and mommy brings a towel and a drink and something to eat and some tissues to blow your nose, and off you go to play with the kids. And your goal is not to hurry back to the house with mommy. It's to disappear within the sandbox with your friends and your kids. And that's what I recommend to people who want to be able to have pleasure and play in bed. Prepare. Bring a drink, bring a towel, bring your lubrication, have a glass of wine, roll a joint, turn off the television, put on some music. Don't listen to country and western music. I never permit that. That's
during sexuality.
I think country and western music can kill sexuality.
There's no romance.
That's my
That's
my own trip.
Your country bias.
That's my bias. Yes. People fear being out of control. They have a constant focus on orgasm as a goal, as opposed to goalless sex. They leave sex for when somebody's too tired. People who have sexual problems seem to leave sex for the last time at night. And it's the worst time to have good sex. The fact is, if you're daytime people and you have daytime jobs, life is on a soporific direction for you. In other words, once we awaken in the day, eventually what we're leading toward is sleep. So we have a rise in energy in the morning. You have something to eat. Mornings at your business, your office, your job are filled with certain types of activities and energy levels. And you come to a midday and you have something to eat. And the afternoons are different as you start floating and directing yourself toward ending your day's work and start thinking about what you have to do next. I have to pick up stuff at the cleaners on the way home. I need a bottle of milk on the way home. You get home, you have dinner preparation, and you do your email, and you make your phone calls, and you have some communication with kids if you have them, and you're winding down to sleep, and you start thinking about tomorrow. Do I have a blouse that I have to iron? Who do I see at 10 o'clock in the morning tomorrow? And you get into bed, and your body is heading towards sleep, and your mind is on tomorrow. And now is not the time to rev it up to have a quick sexual connection. So I try to encourage people to look at their lives and each day of their life it's like it's a pie with 24 pieces in it. And that there are some pieces that are spoken for already, that you can't cut a slice for yourself. But spontaneity dies quickly when there are issues, and so it will not come back by itself. It doesn't magically reappear. You can work the spontaneity if you have an intentionality. And so I encourage people to find time to plan ahead, to be sexual. I talk about a script of one person giving the other person a call early in the day and say, "Hi, honey. Listen, I can get out early at 3 o'clock today. Why don't you see if you can get out? I'll meet you at home. I'll shit, shower, and shave, and we'll get into bed and play for a couple hours. And if we skip dinner, the hell with it. We can always order a pizza." But you plan ahead. And so from the time at 9 o'clock in the morning when somebody calls the other person until 3 in the afternoon, I call erotic anticipation, where you're able to take some time to think about what's ahead and to remember some wonderful times in the past that you've been sexual, and to reawaken some of the senses. We have 5 senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And We can remember in our minds, we can remember fragrances, we can remember what our partner looks like and what his or her body looks like. We can remember tastes and what a touch is like. And so we can utilize all these senses in the preparation to go home and play. So I call that erotic anticipation.
Which really mirrors what we're doing when we're dating, right? It's not like we just spontaneously get together. We plan, we call each other up,
Oh,
we say,
oh,
"Do you want to go out on Friday night?" etc.
oh, yeah. I mean, the fact is, when you're going to go out on a date, you're planning ahead. You groom. You may sit down at your makeup table and look at yourself in the mirror and think about the fact that you're going to be sexual, and you get a mindset so that you're able to go out on the date and anticipate pleasure. And pleasure is what it's all about. If you're not looking to procreate, it's just about pleasure. Some people want more, some people want less. People who don't masturbate or are able to speak about it with their partner will often have problems. Jealousy can be a killer, but that's such a large topic it doesn't even pay to start talking about it here in this situation. That there are conflicts in the sexual and non-sexual value system. It's a relationship where there are strict gender roles in the relationship. Those become difficult in the sexual relationship. People assume sexual exclusivity. It's one of the things that I always ask people who say that they're sexually exclusive. I say, was that something that you guys agreed upon, or was that something that simply happened? It seems that with many people, all of a sudden, first intercourse with that partner means sexual exclusivity. It's an assumption. It's not something that's discussed. And you believe that sex should be spontaneous. And that's also difficult because planning will help return spontaneity sometimes, but not always. Some people just have to continue to plan to cut a slice of the pie when it's a good time to do it. If weekends are a good time to do it, you can use the rest of the week to know that all touch is not in sexual direction, that you can hug, kiss, neck, pet, touch, and it's not going to lead to intercourse. Sex is also seen by many people as serious business as opposed to fun. There's an aversion or an embarrassment to props or sexual dress or toys, faking orgasm, sexual secrets are a killer, religious orthodoxy where sex can be seen as a duty, where people don't feel safe with each other. There's no physical or emotional safety. There's some physical illness, that sex is traded for non-sexual goals, that there's expectation of orgasm for somebody, that you have to give orgasm to another person. You never give orgasm to another person. I talked to a client just the other day who happened to say, well, I want him to come because that's part of my work to do, is to make him come. So there's a goal, and it's an unnecessary goal. Oral sex is kind of a biggie nowadays. I talk about oral sex being like today's handshake. And where one person likes oral sex and the other person doesn't, that's something that needs to be discussed and worked on. There's undesirable changes in personal hygiene or grooming that can interfere with sexuality. Weight gain is a killer for many people, where one partner becomes obese. There's a power imbalance in the relationship. And after those are dealt with, then we can talk about sexual dysfunctions. But all of the others are things that are imposing upon the relationship and the sexuality. That's basically it.
Yeah, that's a great list. I mean, I would say yes to all of those, and I'm not sure I've ever run them all down in a list before. So that's actually very helpful. And I would, well, several thoughts as you're talking. First of all, obviously, Dr. Hersh is not a Mormon, so some of his suggestions like drinking wine and rolling a joint. Obviously, some of you are going to be like, whoa, that's not maybe something I would try, but those are very useful things for people wherein that fits into their value system. So please don't freak out if you're listening to this.
I don't work exclusively with any population,
Right, exactly.
and I use humor, and that statement is meant in a humorous vein. Is that coming to the adult sandbox prepared for pleasure, and whatever you define as pleasure. You don't want to have a glass of wine? Well, certainly bring a drink of soda, of water, of something else, because you do get thirsty while you're having sex.
Well, and I also want to mention that I've actually worked with some very traditional Mormons that because there is such a anxiety around orgasm or performance or for a variety of reasons, they will come up with unique ways that they even talk to their ecclesiastical leaders about and sometimes have a very good conversation about. So I have worked with Mormons that will drink a glass of wine, prior to sexuality just to help with anxiety. And there are obviously a lot of people who use marijuana or other things like that, especially with female arousal disorders or things of that nature. So it's not unheard of.
It's part of the day that we are in. It's not a phrase that I would have used 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It's much more common now, and it's much more apparent in people's lives that there's an occasional use of marijuana.
Yeah, and for some people, they would rather drink a glass of wine than maybe go get an anxiety medication, or something along those lines, especially just for sex type of purposes. So, yeah, so I just wanted to point that out. But I think that this is a great list that if you're listening to this podcast would be worth repeating and, just listening to it again, and just kind of gives you a list of things that you can at least start possibly having a dialogue with your partner about. That's really wonderful. So, so that kind of takes care of the question that I was going to ask you, which what are some common issues that couples are facing? And so why don't we get into maybe the other side of things, which I think you started doing with some of the work on planning and things of that nature. But what are some sex tips? In other words, what are some things that people can intentionally do differently or be mindful of that start addressing some of these issues that you'd like to cover? For example, this woman who asked you to come and talk to her group about what actually builds passion instead of what gets in the way of it.
Well, that's the hard one for me to answer. That really is the hard one for me to answer. I really don't know what will increase passion. I guess the alleviation of the things that I say kill passion.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be opening up the areas that are closed. If there's no conversation about sexuality, begin having some conversation about sexuality. Communication is very important, and if there's shyness, I guess you have to work with being able to cross that boundary. For many people, they don't think about sex that much, and they don't necessarily walk around with desire. But we have found that very often people can become desirous once they agree to being sexual. Once there is arousal, then there can come desire. You don't always have to start with desire first. It can be part of your partnership contract and agreement that we will accept sexual invitation even if we're not feeling aroused. That's part of a partnership responsibility of sharing and of dancing together with your partner. Even if you're not interested in dancing, and then you get up and dance when the music starts and you realize, gee, I'm having a good time. Agreeing to being sexual with an open mind and an open attitude to know that once you are aroused, you may find that you desire to continue.
Can you talk a little bit for the audience about what we would mean between the difference between arousal and desire?
Well, I see arousal as that the mind and the body is been awakened or is awakening. and is conscious, and there's feeling, and there's consciousness of your genitals, and there's consciousness of being turned on. Arousal is being turned on. Desire is more mental. Arousal is the physical, and desire would be the mental.
So that you can be desirous to engage with your partner even if your body is not aroused at that point, is what you're saying. And that's that intentionality to lean in towards your partner.
Well, I see the reverse, really, that you can agree to stimulation that will cause arousal, and then desire to continue will come after that or during that process.
Two things I'd like to hit out of the list that you mentioned that I think in particular maybe are things that we deal with in our own Mormon culture. You mentioned one of the things that can get in the way are these gender roles, so strict gender roles. And we tend to have a lot of that in Mormonism, right? Where for the most part, not obviously every Mormon family functions this way, but there's a lot of emphasis on the husband being the provider and the wife being the homemaker or nurturing children, etc. So do you want to talk a little bit about that more specifically?
Well, when there are strict gender roles, very often one partner is responsible for all the initiation. So one partner is taking the risks for rejection, or the other partner simply is an acquiescent partner as opposed to one who is being responsive. And when there are strict gender roles, I would say that acquiescence is probably much more present than responsiveness. And so you don't have the ability to say no because it's inappropriate for you in a strict gender role not to be available to your partner.
When you said that the lower libido partner usually wins, this is probably the example where that would be the exception to that, is if the lower libido partner is in a position where they feel like they have to your word, acquiesce to the higher libido partner, then that's probably doesn't feel a lot like winning, right? And so I see that a lot in my couples. Like I think most Mormon men that I work with are actually really cognizant of being good husbands. And so they're oftentimes exactly what you mentioned, is that the higher libido, if he's the higher libido partner, he will deny his own needs and definitely be more cognizant of his wife. And that can create a lot of problems as far as their communication and his own sexual satisfaction. However, when I say, and I'm probably disrespectful when I say this, but when I see that with the patriarchal pricks, in other words, those that really take on that sense of I am the patriarch and I am the one who gets to decide and I am the one who wants to have a certain type of sexual life, then the lower libido partner definitely loses out, because if it's again the wife, she feels like she has to perform or she has to be. And then there's the kind of combo where it's not necessarily that he's a patriarchal prick, but she has that gender role that he may not be imposing, but the culture is. And so then she's still acquiescing, even though maybe he wouldn't necessarily want her to, or he doesn't even realize that she's doing that.
After a while, he does realize that. And partners who are acquiescing, we're making an assumption about a heteronormative situation, and we're making an assumption about strict gender role situation. And if he is a good husband, he doesn't want his partner to not want to do it. And when your partner is not responsive but is acquiescent, that lowers the pleasure for the man. And when that happens, there's less of a desire for that particular partner. And when there is a high libido in the male and he's not getting it at home with a responsive partner, chances are he may step out of that home and be sexual somewhere else and make a unilateral decision because he knows it can't be discussed within the family. And that private behavior between the two of them becomes secretive behavior where there's an interference with the mutuality. That people tend to do what they want sexually. And if they find a partner is not interested, they may go outside of the marriage. I mean, the fact is that after a couple has been together for a while. Now, and a while is an ambiguous term. There's no specific length of time, but after people have been together for a while and are sexual with each other, they have what I call, I'm not the only one who uses the term, leftover sex. He knows where not to go, and she knows where not to go. And what they have together is whatever is left over. And so where there are behaviors that are beyond the desire and willingness to share, and those behaviors are less common behaviors, people tend to seek other partners to do those behaviors with. That's the way humans are.
And I think in our culture, we see a lot of that being maybe not so much within another partner, but they'll turn to pornography or masturbation, which, again, in our culture, oftentimes that's seen as much of a betrayal almost as another partner anyway. I think what you're getting at is that when you are in an exclusive relationship and you're not able to communicate about these different desires or needs or wants or fantasies, then people feel very either trapped, or they're one of the only options that seem plausible is the secrecy. If not, the relationship feels like it might implode.
I hate the word pornography. Pornography is just such a moral and political terminology, and I so prefer sexually explicit material.
Yeah.
It's a much less pejorative comment and doesn't have a whole bunch of morality and politics to it.
Which we have a lot of these days, for sure.
Well, not necessarily just within your particular culture, but just generally. That there's a lot of attitude about it. And what sexually explicit material leads to is masturbation, or masturbation leads to sexually explicit material as an adjunct of something that increases the pleasure for it. One of the questions that I ask people who use sexually explicit material, I said, you're watching it and you masturbate, and after you ejaculate, do you continue to watch the next 45 minutes of the movie? You say, oh no, of course not. The sexually explicit material is used as an accompaniment to the masturbation, and that's what its purpose is. It's a good stress reliever.
Right, other than in systems where it's not allowed, right? Or it hasn't been contracted or it hasn't been discussed.
But you see, if masturbation is not permitted within the relationship, it takes a private behavior and creates secrecy about it. People don't stop masturbating because they get into a contract with somebody not to masturbate. If you get into a contract with somebody about not masturbating, all it does is it makes it a secret behavior. If you come in a contract with your partner not to use sexually explicit material and you want to use sexually explicit material, you will find a way to take that private behavior and make it secret. I mean, I guarantee if you get a partner who is willing to say, nope, I'm never going to use porn, I'm not going to masturbate again, they mean to tell the truth, but they won't be able to keep it.
And this is a huge part of the work I do with Mormon couples, because that is,
I'm sure
I think,
it is.
the
I'm sure it
expectation, right? The cultural expectation. And I can't tell you how many people I have talked to, particularly men, but women as well, that say, I thought that as soon as I would be able to have sex with my partner, I would no longer need to masturbate or want to masturbate. And that is a huge shock and surprise to them when that is still a part of their sexual choices that they make.
And within your culture, there is the goal to refrain from intercourse prior to marriage. And in fact, in reality, to take somebody who has not had intercourse with a partner, you don't know whether you're going to be able to dance well with them. And if that area has not been resolved, it will rear its ugly head in the relationship somehow.
One of the things I talk about in that regard is that there's obviously people who I have met with who are not necessarily Mormon, or maybe are Mormon, but did have premarital sex together, had great sex, and then yet still run across a lot of sexual problems within their marriage. So in other words, that whole idea that we'll be able to try it out and see if we're compatible doesn't necessarily equate to no sexual issues throughout your marriage.
True, and that's where all of the things on the list that I have given you come in that will interfere with some relationship that has had good sex.
Right.
And that doesn't show up for a while.
Right. And then there are people that I say, kind of have that type of relationship where they, in my language, kind of barely make it to the temple. In other words, they're doing everything but intercourse, and there's a lot of sexual chemistry, and they're having a lot of fun, and they tend to adjust somewhat well to the marital relationship and continue to have a good sexual relationship. I think that maybe what you're talking about, which has been a concern for me, is those couples where sexual excitement was never really on the list of things to look for in a potential partner. So we kind of actually do this. We come up with lists as young men and young women. Well, in the young women we did anyway, of what to look for in a potential partner, right? And so you look for a smart person, a respectful person, somebody who holds the priesthood, who's a member of the church. I mean, you make this list of all these attributes. Never on that list were we encouraged to look for somebody that we felt aroused by or hot or that we thought was attractive. Those seemed like superficial type of things. And so some of the issues that I come up with some of these sexless marriages that I look at is when I go back and do the assessment and the history of their dating and how they met up with. And they were great friends. There was a lot of emotional intimacy, but they never really had that type of chemistry that you would think you would want to look for. And that's very hard to create if it's not necessarily there to begin with. Is that something you would agree with?
That's accurate, yes. Yes. It's not something you can learn.
Yeah. Which then gets me to my next question that I wanted to make sure and ask is, so much of, I think, what we're dealing with as adults with sexuality and some of these difficulties in communicating and being shy or being embarrassed, or even our egos being hurt by the idea that a partner may not like something we like or is not attracted to a certain aspect of our way of doing things. How much of that could we head off by offering better sexual education as teenagers?
That's a primary key, Natasha. I mean, the fact is we lack sexual education. We have attitudes about sexuality, but we don't have education. Part of the education is what people do, what people like, how do people define pleasure, what does erotic mean to them? Is erotic even a construct that they include in their lives?
And so what are some of the things that you feel would be most important as parents or as educators in school communities or whatever to be able to start talking to kids about?
Well, when it comes to sexual education, I kind of look toward the Dutch system. And I don't have the particulars about it, and I'm not what I would call a sexual educator, except on a person-to-person basis in working with adults. I don't work with kids, and I never have worked with kids, and it's not my forte. I'm also a proponent of being sexual before marriage, which doesn't fit in with your culture. And I don't try to convert people, but you have to work within the framework of what's dictated to people and what is expected of the couple's form.
And maybe where I could nuance that a little is what I was just talking about before, which is there are abilities to be sexual to a point. So maybe not vaginal penile intercourse wouldn't fit into the, I guess, value system.
I don't know what's acceptable into the Mormon sexuality. What I know about your culture would fill a thimble and leave room for a finger.
Right.
Well, it's true. It's true. I've read some things about it, but I really have no. I don't grok it. Does grok, is grok a word that you know or understand?
I do not know that word.
Well, grok, Grok, is a word out of Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. Grok is best defined probably as knowledge that has a fullness, that there's an internal feeling about it, that you understand it to the depth as it's a part of you, that you grok an idea, that you can feel it one with it.
I like that.
I do too.
Yeah, and it's complicated, obviously, in my culture.
Yes,
I
it
mean,
is.
there's messages about, don't do anything that would arouse any aspect of arousal in your body. Well, that would mean even thinking about something, right? So there's
Yeah.
messages like that, and then there's obviously tons of students at BYU making out and having fun dates and not necessarily crossing boundaries that they feel would need to go to confession or things of that nature. I think most Mormon youth feel like touching genitalia would probably be crossing a line, and definitely penile vaginal intercourse would be crossing a line. Oral sex would probably be crossing a line. So yes, it's definitely somewhat rigid as far as exploration, although there's also the loopholes that people tend to get into to avoid vaginal penile. Then they'll do oral or anal because that isn't real sex. And so then you get into those kinds of issues where sexuality is compartmentalized into certain acts instead of being more holistic and seeing every aspect, anything from holding hands to more in-depth types of behaviors to being part of your sexuality. So I think where I would totally be in line with you and be very comfortable talking to a Mormon audience is this idea of being willing to explore some aspect of your sexuality with a potential partner, whether that is the gazing in the eyes, whether that's kissing, whether that's holding hands, whether that's certain body touch that couple particularly feels comfortable with. I think that is very important to see how you respond to each other in that way. At times, more Orthodox members will, with pride, say, well, we kissed for the first time over the wedding altar. That's something I definitely don't agree with. And I don't think that there's anything in Mormon doctrine that really supports the necessity of going to that extreme.
You have problems with your culture that I don't have to deal with.
Right.
It's just too limiting. The fact is that when one partner wants some type of activity that the other partner is not willing to do, if the desire is strong enough, they will go find it. And then, as I say, private behavior becomes secretive. That I work within the structure of the individual or the couple. I see a lot of couples, and I work within that couple as opposed to necessarily what background they come. I'm seeking to resolve the questions that they have. I'm seeking to help the couple to learn ways to create balance in a relationship that they came to me because of a lack of balance.
I do agree with you that the pattern I have been very much privy to is that when you try to hold one partner accountable for behavior that maybe is seen as amoral or doesn't fit into the other person's erotic template and expect that one partner to change, that's a very difficult prospect that oftentimes has very unintended negative consequences, which anything from resentment to, like you're saying, going back into a secretive behavior, etc., and can leave people very unequipped to really have a sustainable relationship that gets them both what they want and desire in the long run. And I will just say that I think the church in our culture doesn't necessarily help with that because it's a system of confession and accountability and changing behavior, which when it comes to our sexuality doesn't necessarily always work.
You can work with a couple about accessibility and accountability and about change of behavior, but ultimately all it does is it takes privacy and creativity. And when you agree to something that you didn't want to agree to, you'll find a way to do it. That's just the way people are. You're not enthusiastic about doing it with me, and you're not responsive about doing it with me. And if it's a high eroticism that I want and have, I will simply go and seek it somewhere else, and it will cause secrecy. And it's just the way it is. I don't want you to watch pornography. Okay, sweetie, I won't ever do that again. And what that'll simply do is I'll be more careful about doing it. I'll make sure that I don't leave my phone sitting around. I'll make sure that I erase my browser history. It'll make it secretive. But if it's something that's erotic to you, you will do it. It's a promise that cannot be kept.
So, given that example really quick, and maybe this is how we can end, what are the options other than that scenario?
I don't have an option for you within your culture. I don't have an answer. I don't have a magic answer
forget the culture for a minute. If you had a couple that didn't want secrecy and yet were trying to make room for this type of erotic difference, what would be some of the ways that that couple could successfully negotiate that?
I can't give you a general answer to that. I can simply say it's different in each couple. And when I work on the implicit model. Are you familiar with the implicit model?
I am, but I'm sure my audience is not.
Okay.
So would you?
That there are certain steps that I deal with people, and that is it. I basically start with creating a system of permission where they're permitted to be who they are, where they have permission to think about the things that they like to think about, that they have permission to engage with their partner and to communicate with their partner. And that's a permission. It's to create safety and a sense of being willing to be vulnerable with your partner, which produces good sex. And then when it's necessary, I provide them with some limited information where they have some bits of information and they're missing information between the spots that they know, and I try to help them, give them some information that will fill in or correct some misinformation. If they have a hard time starting things, then I'll give them specific suggestions. And I don't necessarily say that these are homework, because I don't talk about it as homework. When I make a specific suggestion, I'm saying I'd like you to evaluate these ideas. I'd like you to try it out and see and let me know if you see any difference when you use these specific suggestions. And I try to stay on a cognitive level. And if then we're not moving anywhere, then and only then do you start going deeper and getting into an intensive therapeutic situation. But I deal with a lot of things on cognitive level, people who are willing to communicate and willing to contract and come to agreement about spending specific time and trying things, not as homework, but as things that they can personally evaluate. How does it work for us? This isn't the right way to do it. Is this a way that will help you guys get back into balance?
I think that's a wonderful way to end. I think that's exactly right. There isn't a solution that we're going to be able to say on a podcast that's going to fit any one couple's particular situation, because every couple is unique and every couple has to do this work for themselves.
That's right. They come to you in a state of imbalance, and you try to work with them so that they can create balance for themselves as they define it.
So with that, do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with?
You and I have been able to do this without even talking about addiction, and isn't that wonderful?
I know. I feel like I talk about addiction on almost every other podcast. Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
What I would say basically about sexuality and addiction is I'm a pretty strict constructionist as far as denotation and don't like all of the connotation. And I basically see addiction as a physiological dependence. In other words, when alcoholics stop drinking, they can get the sweats, their heart rate can go up, their reflexes increase, etc. They can develop the DTs, they can die. And heroin addicts, they have their own withdrawal syndrome. But again, it involves a physiological change. But I'm not implying that there aren't psychological changes as well. But if a sex addict is denied sex, they may have all sorts of psychological problems, but they do not go into a physiological withdrawal. And I think when we get away from the physiological withdrawal and bastardize the definition of addiction, I think we're hurting our clients. And I think the construct of sex addiction is very destructive in a relationship.
And I would agree with you on that. I think that's actually how we both met, was through avenues where we were on the same lines. To your point of having it cause problems within the relationship, when you have somebody who's sick or broken, versus somebody who's healthy and well. But when it comes to sexuality, then that sets up the stage for some really unfortunate conversations that aren't the types of conversations we're talking about in this podcast that we're hoping people can start having.
When you talk about sick or broken, I use the phrase sick, wrong, or broken, and it's something that I use in therapy a lot, is talking about you're not being sick, wrong, or broken. And that's something that I like to use. I like to take those terms and destroy them. That the person is not sick, wrong, or broken for coming to me as they are.
Yeah, I love that.
I think you're terrific.
I think you're terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, kiddo. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
A trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary.